So I guess really what I want to get into right up front is this idea around where society is and where it's going, and what is the role for humility. Because I mean, when you look at our society and look at particularly our leaders, you don't get a great image of humility. It seems to be this again, as you said, and this Western ideology of stronger, the strong white man who sort of is rich and powerful and controls things. And I know, and you do some work around this idea around this sort of tension between Western ideology and Indigenous and even the tradition of a religious sort of dogma. So maybe, Anne, I'd love to start with you around this idea of your perspective from both as a religious scholar and as an Indigenous scholar, an Indigenous woman. Where does humility fit into those two different worlds that you sort of represent?
Look, in the Western world it doesn't. In my world it does. Being Aboriginal, our leadership is based on humility. It's not one of ego, it's not one of, senior leadership. We're more egalitarian, valuing everybody's input and leadership within community. And having a deep sense of humility in the sense of when you're engaging and communicating within community or, just in public forums with politics, whatever, having the decency to listen to what people are saying to you. And having a sense of humility that you don't have all the answers and that perhaps together as a collective we might find the answer, bringing and valuing all the different perspectives that we have in this country, particularly as we look across the multi-faith community. Christianity had this notion of their superiority and an assumption that they knew and know what's best for everybody, and therefore speak from that perspective of arrogance. Whereas, within Aboriginal spirituality, there's a deep reverence and humility that comes with knowing one doesn't have all the answers and that we as a collective are here to be able to learn from one another. And that's also creation as well. And we see creation as a teaching tool as well. Because we learn a lot from our environment and the different animals and plants and habitats. But what I see in the leadership today, I see our Prime Minister Albanese struggling to embody humility, I think. But the media and the opposition government won't allow him to do that. They're always calling him a coward, calling him soft, or criticising his position because he is not verifying or being typical in his leadership of what they assume a leader should be: arrogance, ego-driven, obnoxious, and my way is the right way, and all of this. And I find with him a little bit more reserved, a little bit more humility, wanting to be a little bit open. But sadly, he's always put in a bad position or pushed to a corner where he has to come out and be more assertive or justify his behaviour or actions. But within the church, that sense of humility, which you think would be embodied in church leadership, no, sadly, it's too defined by colonialism, imperialism, how would you say, white superiority. There's very little humility in the church, which is sad, because we need to see more of that. I'm finding probably more humility in the multi-faith leadership than I find in our leadership, and I think we could take a leaf out of their teachings to learn how to be more humble, more, open to listening to the discourse and dialogues that are emerging within Australia that we could be learning from.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, Anne. And there's a whole heap of things there I think I'd love to unpack a bit more. But Peter, you come at this from a I guess I don't know, intellectual, I'm not sure how you describe the philosophical sort of origins, but this idea of wrestling with this idea of humility, complex problem solving and this sort of area. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective as where do you see the role of humility in society, and maybe even some of its origins or genesis and how it's evolved.
Well, I mean, we've good intellectual work, good relational work has always recognised that we could be wrong. You've got to begin with that fallibility. I often say that critical thinking begins with the giving and taking of reasons, but people sometimes bleep over the taking part of that. It is about listening to reasons from other people. But not only about giving and taking reasons, but to try and explain why that reasoning might be meaningful or matter to other people. I mean, I could give you my reasons for something, but that doesn't mean to say that they ought to be persuasive for you. There are situations in which, simply as matters of fact of the natural world, we can reason towards what we think will work. We can reason that paracetamol does not cause autism pretty well, for example. So that's okay. But when we're reasoning about what we ought to do societally, what goals and projects we ought to be pursuing, then that kind of shared thinking, shared understanding, shared reasoning is really important. So to do that properly, you have to have a sense that you don't have, the fabled unique position from which everything makes sense. There's a lot of people who might imagine that everything seems perfectly clear to me, and if only everybody could see things as clearly as I do, we'd have no more problems. But that's just a fantasy. So we've got to understand that our position is as unique as everybody else's. We don't have that privileged view from nowhere that can allow us to take in all considerations and make perfect sense of it. We're just one of many views, and we have to try and work with each other towards an end where we can have a shared understanding of why we think something is the best course of action or the best recommendation or whatever it might be. And all of that's just impossible if you think you've got the right answer and don't need to listen to anybody else, because with that conviction is the death of inquiry. You don't need to pursue any more knowledge. You can just rest knowing that you know the truth, and that's a pretty dangerous place to be.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And a lot of, in some senses, my own genesis of discovery of humility. I mean, I grew up in a very religious background, so understand that the teachings of Jesus in terms of thinking about others first, and the first will be last, and the last will be first, and the golden rule, and all these sort of things, which are fundamental to Christian theology. And some of those ideas have been taken all around the world, and some of those ideas pre-existed that. There's just a truth that seems to be in there. But I think as I've come into a commercial sort of secular sort of environment where I'm starting companies and commercializing things and I'm observing this tension between some people who are just truly naturally humble, they're curious and they're interested in this idea of what do you think, versus, and then you've got this other group that are very dogmatic and very strong and very the paternalistic sort of macho sort of image. I'm interested, Anne, in the Indigenous perspective, because when I talk to even Indigenous people about this, of course Indigenous people are not homogeneous. I mean, there's tension there. But what I'm interested in is if you think of it even in the Christianity perspective, so the core fundamental of Christianity is humility. And now we've found ourselves 2,000 years later where you're saying it doesn't really look terribly humble, particularly in the evangelical church in America at the moment. But in Indigenous cultures, it's obviously there's still a tension there, but there's still a pretty strong ethic of humility within Indigenous cultures. So can you talk about the tension that is there? Because obviously we have Indigenous leaders who don't come across terribly humble, like we have Western leaders and Christian leaders and some that are. But talk about how the Indigenous people, you think, were able to sustain that essence for tens of thousands of years, and maybe in what circumstance does that fall down and not work, and then other people who have that history but then go down a different pathway.
Look, the struggle we have, or the tension we have, is walking in two worlds. So we present ourselves differently in each one of these worlds. Within our own traditional community, that leadership of self-assurance, even arrogance, is not replicated. You'd be slapped down real quick, okay? We come with a deep sense of humility and grace, understanding our teachings, our way, and knowing that elders are the respected knowledge holders here. And it's with them that we gain perspective, knowledge, wisdom, whatever. So when we sit down in this space, it is with humility and grace, because that's what they reflect in their leadership, is that same deep sense of, understanding that they're still learning. We have a culture that is lifelong learning. It never stops learning. And our old people, replicate that in the way they provide leadership, because they're constantly reminding us we're learning. Well, they're constantly reminding us that the spirit world speaks to us, and country speaks to us. So we never stop learning. Whereas I find when we walk into the Western world, we take on a different persona, or some people take on a different persona, simply because humility does not work in the Western world.
It has no currency.
There's no currency except to be seen as weak, okay? That everyone can walk over the top of you. And that, you have nothing of worth to bring to the table. So somehow, your value and your worth is judged differently if you appear humble, and grace isn't extended to you. So when we come into that world, you see a different persona that is projected, because we take your image, and that's the image we project out. So you'll see that arrogance, you'll see sometimes that aggression, obnoxious nature being propelled by our leaders within these spaces. And you'll always find most of them are men, because we're talking about Western patriarchy, and that's all they give value to. They do not give value to a black woman. Okay, so very often you will never, it's a rare occasions you might see a black woman speak, and I mean it's rare, because, of the patriarchy. Men are the knowledge holders, men are the wisdom, men are everything. Whereas in our world, that's not the case. Men and women share that leadership position. It's egalitarian, and one would not do or make decisions without the other. We sit in a collective, because we don't work on an individual base, we're a collective people. So that's where that sense of humility comes, that ability to listen to one another, because it is as the collective that we make decisions. In the Western world, it is all individualism driven, and the leader makes the decision or has the final say. Boards vote. We don't discuss, so even if you're opposing, you're out in the cold, because we've already made a decision. Whereas in our world, it is conversational. We will talk about our differences or conflicts until we can resolve them and go away respectful of each other's place and position. We don't find, because the Western world is also driven by modernity and fast pace and decision making, capitalism, economics. We've got to do all of this stuff in such a hurried way that we don't even take time to stop and to just sit and listen to one another and have true conversations that are valued based but also respectful. And if we do disagree, there's no time given to the discussion that might see us come to some point of consensus. It's always a vote, and you're out in the cold if you're in opposition. So these are the things that we have to contend with on a daily basis in walking in two worlds, is how do I bring myself to this world and have me as an Aboriginal woman valued for my integrity, the cultural integrity in which I bring to the table. More times than not, it's not. It has no relevance, it has no worth and no value within a broader Western system.
Yeah, I love that idea. And when we talked last time, this idea around consensus, and actually continuing to talk. And I know, I was really impacted by Auntie Miriam Rose from the Daly River region, who introduced this idea, the Didi, this concept of deep listening, of actually fundamentally deep listening. And I when I do my acknowledgement of traditional owners in my classes, and whenever I get the opportunity, I'm very appreciative of the gift of this concept, because it's not something that I guess Indigenous people invented, but it's something that Indigenous people have been able to characterise, and it's something that you've actually brought into and very generously offering it to us in the world, in the Western world, saying, you guys should maybe just slow down a little and start listening, not only to what's happening around you, but listening to yourself and listening to the world you're in. And so I love that idea, but it takes time. And you're right, and I think you've called out one of the challenges of this is that consensus and listening takes time, and that doesn't sort of coalesce really nicely with the Western ideology. So
no, because it's also building relationships. Relationships take time. They don't just happen overnight, and they happen through listening, sharing, openness, respect, value, and humility. And that's what we're missing in this world, because we're in such a rush to, I don't know, what is it, capitalism, to industrial? I don't know what it is, but why are we in a hurry? What's going to be different if we slow down?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's that intentionality of slowing down. Peter, you mentioned sort of curiosity, or this understanding, trying to ask questions and understand. And I love, in some senses, that's what Anne's talking about, is sitting in a yarning circle, sitting in a circle and trying to understand each other so we can understand the perspective. So from a philosophical point of view, that there's obviously still a tension even in your world, in this idea around, as you described before, around you've got to actually give and receive, knowledge. So talk to us a little bit about how critical this spirit, or this willingness to be curious, to actually really sincerely want to understand, rather than this very dominant process of I just want to convince you. So it's almost like curiosity versus convincing. Those two C words. Tell us the conflict there.
Yeah, there's an old joke that says, I'm not arguing with you, I'm explaining to you why you're wrong. So that's from that position of just, we're not even going to bother trying to exchange. But it's important to appreciate the root of the word curiosity means to care. If you curate an exhibit, you care for what's on display, and you have some thought to why this is happening. So if we're not curious about each other, it's largely because we either don't care or we don't have time to care about each other, because we are busy trying to add value, usually to someone else's system in our lives. So it's really important, I think, that we have this notion of curiosity connected to caring. And with that curiosity comes again that fallibility and that humility about there are things about you I don't know. And more, I'm pretty sure they're interesting. I think that's another aspect of humility too, is not thinking that you're the only one with the interesting stories to tell. Everybody has something interesting to say here. And it's very interesting, just following on from Anne's point, I think that the narrow way we talk about humility too. Like, we do admire it in Western patriarchal societies when it's somebody who has already proven their success, but they make light of it when you go, oh, what a wonderful, what wonderful humility. So we admire that. But to the person who is just humble, we don't offer that same level of admiration. I think that's a real problem, because it's a twisting of the value in some ways. I mean, yes, we do appreciate it in those narrow contexts, but we can do it more broadly without having to have had something behind them that they're being humble about. Just being humble is a virtue in itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I remember reading a quote from C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity. He talked about, do not imagine a humble person as someone who's this smarmy, sort of lowly person who sits in the corner and doesn't want anyone to talk to them. When they walk in the room, they're more likely to be quite a pleasant chap. They're probably someone who actually looks you in the eye and asks you interesting questions and is really curious and you'll probably like them, and if you don't like them, it's probably because you're a bit envious of how comfortable and relaxed they seem around other people. And in some ways I think there's a tension there, because even the word humble, and we've sort of danced around that, it sort of means different things to different people. So humble, and in C.S. Lewis's example, even then it had this idea that it's a weak, sort of small person who actually just does the work and doesn't care who gets the attention, and that's a good trait, but that's even in your Indigenous perspective. is not really the definition of humility, or at least our definition. And I did some research on, I think, some of the great old thinkers, Aristotle and Socrates and those guys, and they sort of shunned humility, but they shunned this ability of humility. Their definition of that was to think lowly of oneself. And that's not humility. That might be meekness or some other sort of character trait. But so what they were sort of resisting was actually not humility. What they were resisting is ego, maybe.
An excess of humility.
Yes, yeah,
What about the golden mean of humility is here. You can be too humble to your own self-deprecation and damage, or you can be not humble enough. Yeah. But that golden mean idea, where there's a level of humility or pride or courage or whatever it might be, where an excess of it is damaging or a vice, as is a deficit of it. But somewhere in there, and that may change with circumstances and with who you're with, but somewhere in there's always an appropriate place to be.